Hi colleagues, and welcome again to DINCast's. Our next episode is looking at leadership and wellbeing, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alastair Campbell, former Director of Communications for Labour, and now well known as a champion for the wellbeing agenda. And I just wanted to ask, we're both locked up here. What are your thoughts on how leaders have been responding to this crisis?
It's been very, very mixed. I think obviously the political leadership in every country in the world has been tested by this. And look, I freely admit to having a bias against the Tories and against Boris Johnson, but I think that he and Trump of the major countries are right up there in terms of who's handled it badly. It's been very interesting to see how many of the people that generally are thought to have handled it well are women. I think my standout leader, if I had to pick one, would be Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. I know New Zealand's a very different sort of country, and it's smaller and it's an island and more, less densely populated maybe than parts of the UK, but they've all had to make the same sorts of decisions. And I think her handling of it has been brilliant. That combination of strategy and empathy and explanation and honesty and all of these things that I think you need to bring out in a crisis to lead your way through it. So I think she's been good. I think Merkel's been good. I think it's interesting again in Scandinavia that the Norwegian, the Danish prime ministers, both women. Taiwan, the president of Taiwan, a woman. So it's that's been quite interesting to see. And I think if you work out, and again I've got to aim off here for. It's always difficult sometimes to aim off what your prejudgments are, but I sort of do hope that this will illustrate to people not just the disadvantages but also the dangers of populist leadership. The fact that Trump and Johnson, I think one of the things that's becoming clear is that they don't really do detail. Well, you have to do detail. It is about the detail in the end.
Or sort of the wider sort of leadership in business as well, not just sort of politics, Alastair. Because we've got no reference points, we've not been here before, there is a certain sense of actually people are making decisions with the best of intentions. They're having to make those decisions at speed. And do you get a sense that actually people are going to be more forgiving because actually you as a leader, you are paid or you're expected to take decisions, and we expect that you won't get them all right, but we expect you to call the big ones well?
I think that's right. But I think it's always difficult in these situations to separate out what public opinion is, what the people are thinking, and what media opinion is, and that sort of centre of gravity that develops around the media. I've actually written a very, very long piece. It's in the New European today. It's 13,000 words, and it's an analysis not just of the government but of the media as well. I don't think either of them have done very well. And I think one of the things I'd say, that the public do give the government the benefit of the doubt up to a point. But I think at the moment we have a sense of the public giving the government the benefit of the doubt, partly because the media is not being that tough. I don't know what your sense of it is, but if I think back to some of the crises that we were involved in, one of our biggest problems was that whatever we did, large parts of the media thought it was wrong. Fuel protests was a big one on that. We couldn't do anything. We couldn't do right for doing wrong. And the foot and mouth epidemic as well. That was actually the point at which I realized the media was really turning against us. That was around the turn of the century. Whereas I think Johnson, to be absolutely frank, I think he gets away with an awful lot, particularly with some of the right-wing press. So I think it's difficult to assess the genuine public mood. It's very difficult to assess that.
So just dwell on that point a little bit more then. Do you think what's changed is, because obviously there's a lot more media channels now than what there was back in the early noughties there. Do you think it's because there are so many different channels, everybody has a voice, and therefore those voices, if you go on those channels, are more amplified? So you get this sense of everybody shouting?
You get a sense of everybody shouting, for sure, but I think I don't think it is that. I think there are more channels, there is more, social media has changed the way that a lot of people consume media, and And in a sense, anybody who's got an interest in this can become their own commentator, and that's what social media has done. I don't know what it is. I mean, it's interesting. I did a podcast the other day with Eamon Malley, who's a journalist in Northern Ireland, and he covered us when we were doing the peace process in Northern Ireland. And he said to me, he said, "What the hell is going on with the press?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the way these briefings," he said, "if that was you guys in the 1990s, you'd be ripped to shreds." And which is kind of what I've been thinking as well. So I think it's more that I think journalism has thinned out an awful lot. So if you think about, I actually said to Eamon, I said, back when he was doing that job then, he was a radio journalist. And let's say you were on one of the main TV channels, you probably did a two-way for the 1 o'clock, a two-way for the 6 o'clock, and a package for the 10 o'clock news. These guys today, they're working literally around the clock. And I think it's thinned out the chance for actually doing what I would define as proper journalism, which is finding out what's going on. So journalism, and this, of course, this gives a huge advantage to the people doing the job that I used to do, because in a sense, they become more, not less, dependent on that official voice. And I think that's what it is.
Your background, what you particularly know for is around sort of communications and things, and we're drifting into here about sort of communications. Why is it so hard to get communications right in a crisis like this? Because surely the outcome you're looking for is really, really sort of clear messages. So what are we not doing in the comms world that we could be?
I think they're doing a lot of things that they're doing. They're not doing them well, and I think they're not doing a lot of things that they should be doing. I think the most important in approach in a crisis is you've got to take the public into your confidence about the decisions that you're making. I think in a normal time, the model of political communications, if you like, is for you take the decision, then you go out, you say what the decision is, and then you get challenged on it and tested it and so forth. I think when it's a crisis as complicated, as multifaceted as this, I think what they should do is actually to be saying, okay, this is off the scale hard, incredibly difficult on all of these different fronts, lots of different possible approaches, lots of decisions we've got to face up to. Here's the thinking that's going on. But the biggest thing for me is that you have to, any situation, but particularly a situation like this, you have to develop, execute, and narrate strategy. And if they have developed a strategy, it's not entirely clear to me what it is. Assuming that they have developed a strategy, they're certainly not narrating it very well. And that's why whenever you talk in a crisis about mixed messaging, and it's an easy accusation to make, of course it is, but I think even their best friends would say that there's been an awful lot of mixed messaging in the way that they've communicated.
And is this partly because, again, we've not been here before, so there is going to have to be an element of, test and learn. And again, I'm perhaps sort of picking up on some of the business side. We've had some really good examples of business leaders who have done the right thing, and we've had other business leaders who've perhaps not done the right thing at the right point in time. Is it because there's no real consequences anymore? Because 20 odd years ago, when I was sort of working sort of public policy, if you fell up or tripped up on something, the consequences were that you would resign and go. And it's the same in business. And I don't get a sense that actually that happens now. Is it because we take less responsibility, or basically nobody cares?
And that is a very good question. I think partly the other thing that's happened as a consequence of this massive storm of media change is that the pace of the news cycle is faster and faster and faster. It means things become a frenzy much quicker, but then they abate a lot more quickly as well. and again, we're back to this whole sort of Trumpian thing. If you've got, I think the public just sort of, they sense there's something wrong about it, but what can they do? And I think likewise with business leaders, you see, when you said some have done the right thing, some have done the wrong thing, who in this kind of crazy world where views are bombarding and crashing against each other the whole time, 24 hours a day, what is right and what's wrong? So I did the Jeremy Vine program yesterday, and there was a phone in about, what we're going to do to pay off this massive debt that's going to accumulate as a consequence of the virus. And you had people saying, oh, well, they should just take all the money off people like Richard Branson. And, Richard Branson's a very wealthy man who gets a lot of media coverage, some good, some bad. But the idea that that's going to solve this crisis is kind of absurd. He would have an argument. So that woman who made that point thinks that whatever he's done in this situation is wrong. I've got no doubt at all he will have an argument as to why he thinks he was right to conduct himself in the way that he has. You've got a situation now, for example, with, you take things like, there'll be all the market now for protective equipment, masks and all that stuff is going to be huge, and it's going to be ongoing. So you will have anybody now who thinks about going into business based on working in the PPE sector. If it suddenly emerges that they're making big profit margins, and the guy who's running the company that's suddenly become big in importing from China actually on the side also runs some sort of disreputable, he's a bad landlord or whatever it might be. It's like, so everybody's making these judgments that they may be right, they may be wrong, they may be fair, they may be unfair, but it's changed the way that we're evaluating other people.
And I think you're right. That's a really good point. That actually, two different people could be right about the same thing.
Yeah.
I work in the social housing sector. I'm really interested in social impact, how my members in the sectors can help sort of local communities. And it's quite often that actually those are the communities who've been hardest hit. And I just wondered whether, on a positive side, although, as I say, looking at the potential sort of recession to come, that might not be possible. But does this give us a chance to at least rethink the inequalities that we've got within our society, and actually have a different conversation both with government and with business about actually we really need to do something about this? Because a lot of the workers that we're calling heroes now are ones who are on minimum contracts,
Absolutely.
0 hours and things like that.
Well, I was watching Channel 4 News for the last couple of nights, and they've had some brilliant reporting on people who work in the care home sector. And there was an interview last night with a woman in Liverpool. She was in tears, and she says, "I'm working here. I get paid, very, very, very badly. I'm terrified about taking the virus from here into my home. I'm terrified about, the fact about the dangers that I'm being surrounded by, all the death that she was surrounded by." And, and then you see, and she said, this idea, I'm going to feel better because they're going to give me a badge and they're going to say that we're a key worker. And I do think that we'll have to see whether this holds, or whether it's just another kind of emotional spasm that we sometimes have. If you think about on the political front, do you remember this is the anniversary this week of John Smith dying? And do you remember when John Smith died and people said, oh, politics is going to become much more collegiate and people will be much more respectful of each other? Well, that didn't last very long. And then, when Princess Diana died, we're a much more loving, touchy-feely sort of country. And yet now look at the way that people talk about Harry, who's her son. And likewise, I think that I hope that some of the arguments that people are seeing out there, the ones that spring to mind for me, I think it's really interesting on the environment. I'm not a religious person at all, but you do kind of wonder whether this is the planet saying, listen, we've been warning you lot for a long time about how you behave and how you're polluting the atmosphere and how you're destroying your own environment. We've been warning you, you haven't listened, so we're going to have to slam the brakes on so you get the message properly. And then coming out of that, whether actually we do all start to just immediately go back and say, right, there's the plane, there's my car, off I go. Or whether actually we will adapt and revise. And then I think the other thing that's interesting is this point about who do we really, really value? There's no doubt if you get the sort of center of gravity in the political and the media world, it's very kind of professional middle class. And the media world in particular, I think, is sort of, it's this kind of, elitist, and I don't think most of them really are in the real world. They constantly sneer at politicians for not being in the real world, but at least most politicians are spending an awful lot of time with their constituents. Mm. And so the idea, these newspapers, but they're at it again at the moment, trying to sort of, demonize the teachers for, quotes, not wanting to go back to work, and these militant unions and so forth. So they very quickly will get back into the language that they've adopted over the years. So do we really value carers? Do we really value refuse workers? Are we still actually going to be in, to bow down before the masters of the universe who, caused the crash in 2008, and yet still sort of pay themselves these kind of eye-watering bonuses? So we'll see. I'm not holding my breath.
So sort of turning to one of your earlier points about those, there are people now who are working ridiculous hours, as you say, in the comms world and things like that. So therefore, as leaders, I don't doubt that, prime minister, politicians, business people, everyday, SMEs trying to keep their businesses afloat are working significantly longer hours under a lot more stress. So you're a champion for well-being, personal well-being now. How would you be dealing with, or how did you deal with these situations of high stress?
At the moment, because I've been in lockdown now for 2 months. I just go for a walk with the dog every morning, and then I'm in the house the rest of the time, kind of, and I keep busy. I think work is incredibly important in this, and that's, again, there are inequalities in that. This divide about who can work at home and who can't. I think we saw that on Monday when you saw the vox pops of people going back to work. It was it's not often you see so many working class people on the news bulletins. So, but I think for people in the leadership positions at the top of government and so forth, I think sleep is incredibly important, but very, very hard to get. One, because you're working such long hours, and also because you're very, very stressed, and sleep's harder anyway. So I think actually being very, I never did this, but I wish I had, being very defiant about sleep. Actually saying, I am going to go to bed early. I think the other thing I'd say is, I think trying to keep fit is important. I think and I think at the moment, I think it's, for a lot of people, I think it's just so easy to think, well, it's not my fault I'm working at home. I'll just stay in all day. Oh God, another Zoom call. Oh God, got to do this. And before you know it, you're doing next to no physical exercise, and you're spending all your time doing something which in normal times we tell each other not to do, which is to look at a screen. And so I think sleep, exercise, I think diet is incredibly important. I think, again, these are stressful circumstances where it makes it more tempting to kind of, just raid the fridge, more tempting to have a bar of chocolate, more tempting to drink alcohol, more tempting, to do the things that day upon day just make you less healthy. And then I think the other thing I would say, within an organization, is what I call maximum openness for maximum trust. In other words, just as I think a crisis management leader should take the country into his confidence, his or her confidence as the leader, I think within an organisation, with the team, I think bringing everybody into your confidence. And also I think allowing people to express opinion, to have opinion. As you said earlier, it's like none of us have ever worked like this before. Yeah, we've all done conference calls, we've done video conferencing and so forth, but we've never just done that all the time.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I had a really interesting discussion yesterday, in fact, about I mean, offices are a sort of Victorian construct in terms of from the industrial era. And as one of my colleagues pointed out, well, actually, we've gone from that Victorian era back to the cottage industry, because you've got all of these people individually working from different places, which is going to affect, as you say, mental well-being. Not everybody's going to have the ideal working arrangements, you know, whether it's broadband or they've got young children or, you know, people to sort of look after. So I mean, I think there's the potential that we are storing up well-being issues for the future. If you've been sat at a kitchen table on a kitchen chair for the last 8 weeks trying to do your job, you must be getting stressed about that by now.
Definitely. And kind of on the mental health agenda, I'm an ambassador for Australians for Mental Health. I work with this organisation in Australia. And a few days ago, they sent me some research work that's been done at the University of Sydney. And they were predicting worst case scenario, best case scenario, 25% rise in suicide, and worst case scenario, 50% rise in suicide, based on the economic consequences of COVID. Now, at the time, I don't know whether it's gone up since, this was a few days ago, Australia had had 97 deaths and 7,000 cases. We've had, you know, I did a tweet last night in terms of the death toll, which they're clearly still trying to massage, but we've gone from Turf Moor, Burnley's ground, to Stamford Bridge, and we're now at Anfield. You imagine Anfield full, that's how many people at least have died in the UK of coronavirus. Now, if you then think of the mental health consequences of the people who've lost their family and their friends and relatives without being able to say goodbye, without being able to have a proper funeral, without being able to console them when they were dying. If you add in the psychological impact on the people who've been working surrounded by all this the whole time, if you work on the think of the psychological impact on children who are being desocialized, of children who've spent years preparing for exams that they're not going to take, of educational attainment that's being lost. If you think of the families that are working, that are living, where the dominant factor in the family is an abusive relationship. I mean, all of these things. Then you think of the economic consequence. I mean, I can remember, you're up in the Northeast, I can remember talking to Alan Milburn after the financial crash, and him saying that there was a period where every time he was coming down from the Northeast to Westminster, his train was delayed because there was a body on the line. So I think we're heading for if we're not careful, we're heading for an absolute tsunami of psychiatric distress. And I don't have a sense that the government's on this. I've noticed, we said earlier, we were discussing who's done this well. I think the best communicator in the most difficult circumstances has been Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. And I've noticed how often he talks about mental health. So yeah, I think there's some very hard times ahead.
So we're coming to the end of our chat, Alastair. I mean, sort of drawn on your, professional and personal sort of experiences over the years, is there one sort of final insight or piece of advice that you'd like to sort of leave viewers with? Perhaps something on the, some of the opportunities that might come out of this particular crisis.
Well, I one of the downsides of this is I actually this week I had a book out, which I've postponed until September. It was about depression. And but I think that one of the kind of insights that I have in relation to dealing with depression is, I suppose, how do I sum it up? In anything bad, it only has meaning if you can find something good to come out of it. And I know it's difficult at a time like this to think, well, what might that be? But it is there. It is there for all of us as individuals. It's there for us all as communities. It's there for us as a country if we're prepared to take it. And yes, you need the leadership, and that's, I think, pretty lacking at the moment. But I think for all of us, there's always something in there that we can find, that we think. So I wrote another piece I wrote for the New European recently, 20 things that would never have happened if we hadn't have had this crisis. Now, they went from, this is a terrible, terrible, terrible admission, right? I used a vacuum cleaner for the first time in my life. I cleaned my own office, right? But then there's the kind of the bigger stuff. Like, on the one hand, it's a bad thing, right? But then reflecting that this is the longest I've ever gone in my life without getting on an airplane, right? And then I think, well, when I think of that, I think that means I've not been here and I've not been there. And then I think, yeah, but that's a good thing. Maybe that is the world sort of resetting itself. And then thinking, well, what will my strategy be for overseas travel in the future? Will I fly quite as often as I did? Will I sometimes say to people, no, I really don't need to come and see you. Let's have a chat on Zoom.
But thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with us, and all the very best with your book, and stay safe and well.
Brilliant. All right, you take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.